The streets were busy, filled with people rushing to their destinations, but in the middle of all the movement, one man sat still. A worn-out shopping cart was his only possession, his clothes tattered, his face weary from years of struggle. People walked past him without a second glance, until Big Shaq came along. Big Shaq, known for his larger-than-life personality and heart, had just stepped out of his car when he noticed something that made him pause. There, sitting on the cold pavement, was a homeless man, his eyes staring down, lost in his own world. Shaq could have walked by like everyone else, but something in that moment made him stop. Maybe it was the way the man clutched his cart as if it held the last pieces of his life, or maybe it was the unspoken pain in his eyes. Shaq had seen a lot in his life, but this moment hit differently. He didn't see just a homeless man. He saw a person, someone with a story, someone who once had dreams just like everyone else. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and did something that left everyone watching completely speechless. What happened next wasn't just an act of kindness. It was something that would change both of their lives forever. But what did Shaq do? And how did this unexpected encounter unfold? Stay with me till the end, because this is a story you don't want to miss. Shaq crouched down, his massive frame making the man in the cart seem even smaller. The homeless man flinched slightly, as if he wasn't used to people stopping, at least, not for the right reasons. His hands gripped the edges of the cart tightly, his knuckles turning white. Shaq could tell life had been tough on him. The deep lines on his face, the tired eyes, the way his shoulders slumped, it all told a story of struggle. For a moment, Shaq didn't say anything. He just observed, letting the weight of the moment settle in. The air felt heavy, as if time had slowed down. People still rushed by, cars honked in the distance, but in that small space on the sidewalk, it was just them. Finally, Shaq spoke. His voice was calm, steady. "What's your name, man?" The homeless man hesitated. His lips parted, then closed again, as if he wasn't sure whether to answer. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "James." Shaq nodded. "James, that's a strong name." James glanced up for the first time, meeting Shaq's eyes. There was something in his gaze, caution, but also curiosity. It had probably been a long time since someone looked at him like a person instead of a problem. Shaq could feel the weight of that. He looked down at the cart. It was filled with a few blankets, an old jacket, and some plastic bags stuffed with items that probably held more value to James than anyone else would understand. Shaq took a breath. He knew this moment wasn't just about handing over money or food. This was bigger than that. Then, with a look of determination, Shaq did something no one expected. Without hesitation, Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. But instead of handing over cash, he did something that caught James off guard. He sat down right beside him. The cold pavement pressed against Shaq's skin, but he didn't seem to care. People walking by started to take notice. A few slowed down, whispering, confused by the sight of the towering celebrity sitting next to a homeless man like they were old friends. James shifted uncomfortably. "You don't have to do this," he mumbled, gripping the cart as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Shaq shook his head. "I want to." His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Tell me your story." James hesitated again, his fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on his jacket. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him that. Most people either ignored him or tossed him spare change before walking away. But this was different. This wasn't pity. This was something else. After a long pause, James sighed, his breath shaky. "I used to have a job," he started, his voice quiet but steady. "Had a family too, a wife, a daughter." His gaze dropped to the ground, as if the memories were too heavy to hold up. Things fell apart. Lost my job, bills piled up, and before I knew it, I was out here. He let out a small, bitter chuckle. Funny how fast life can change. Shaq listened intently, his expression unreadable. But inside, he felt something stir. He had seen success, fame, wealth, things most people could only dream of. But sitting here, listening to James, he was reminded of how fragile it all really was. Just then, a sudden voice interrupted them. "Yo, Shaq, what you doing, man?" A group of people had gathered, some with their phones out, recording. The moment was no longer just between them. It had caught the world's attention. And James, already uneasy, looked like he was ready to disappear. Shaq glanced at the crowd, then back at James. The weight of the situation had shifted, and now all eyes were on them. But what happened next would change everything. James' grip on his cart tightened, his body tensing as the murmurs around them grew louder. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. Most days, he was invisible, just another shadow on the streets. But now, with phones pointed at him and eyes watching his every move, he felt exposed, like a spotlight had been thrown onto a life he'd spent years trying to forget. Shaq could feel a shift too. He glanced around at the growing crowd, then back at James, who looked like he was ready to bolt. Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only James could hear. "Ignore them, man. It's just me and you right now." James swallowed hard, his breath shaky. "I don't do well with all this." He gestured vaguely toward the people watching. His voice was low, almost ashamed. "People don't usually look at me unless it's to move me out the way." Shaq's expression hardened. He had seen this kind of thing before, people too quick to judge, too busy to care. But James wasn't just some story to be recorded and forgotten. He was a man who had lived, struggled, and survived. And right now, Shaq wasn't going to let the world reduce him to anything less than that. He pushed himself up to his full height, towering over the crowd. "Yo, you'll ever stop to ask this man his name?" His deep voice cut through the chatter, silencing the noise for a moment. The cameras were still rolling, but now the energy had changed. Some people shuffled awkwardly, avoiding his gaze. Others looked curious, waiting to see what he would do next. James, still sitting, glanced up at Shaq, confusion flickering across his face. No one had ever defended him before. He had spent so long feeling like he didn't matter, like the world had passed him by. But now, with Shaq standing beside him, the weight of his loneliness felt just a little lighter. Then, before James could process it, Shaq turned back to him and said something that made his heart stop, something he never expected to hear. And in that moment, everything changed. James stared at Shaq, his mind racing. The words had hit him like a shockwave, shaking something deep inside that had been buried under years of hardship. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His throat felt dry, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent so long believing that he didn't matter, that no one cared. But now, standing in front of him was a man the whole world knew, telling him something that shattered every thought he had about himself. Before he could fully process it, a voice cut through the moment. "Hey, what's going on here?" A security guard had stepped forward, eyeing James with suspicion. His gaze flickered to Shaq, then to the cart filled with James' few belongings. "Sir, is this man bothering you?" James immediately shrank back, his fingers gripping the edge of his cart so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had seen this play out before. It always ended the same way, with him being forced to leave, pushed back into the shadows. Shaq's jaw tightened. He stepped in front of James, his massive frame now a shield between him and the guard. "Bothering me." Shaq's voice was calm but firm, the weight of his words carrying power. "Nah, man. We're having a conversation." The guard hesitated, glancing at the crowd still gathered around, cameras still recording. He seemed unsure of what to do next. James, on the other hand, was already preparing for the worst. He reached for his cart, ready to move, to disappear before things escalated. But Shaq wasn't done. He turned to James and did something that no one, especially James, expected. Something that made the crowd gasp, something that changed the entire situation in an instant. The energy in the air shifted, and suddenly, this wasn't just an ordinary encounter anymore. This was something bigger. Just as James reached for his cart, ready to slip away, Shaq did something that made everyone freeze. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his car keys, and held them out to James. The crowd went silent. Even the security guard, who had been seconds away from forcing James to leave, looked confused. James just stared at the keys, his hands trembling. What are you doing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq smiled, but there was no joke in his expression. "That car right there." He nodded toward the sleek black SUV parked by the curb. "It's yours now." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Some people thought it was a prank. Others started whispering in disbelief. But Shaq wasn't playing. He looked James straight in the eyes, his voice steady. "You need a fresh start, man. Somewhere to sleep, somewhere safe. That's your key to it." James blinked rapidly, his whole body tense. I can't take that," he stammered, shaking his head. "I don't deserve." "Don't do that," Shaq cut in, his tone firm but kind. "Don't tell yourself you don't deserve better. Everybody falls, man. But not everybody gets someone to remind them they can stand back up." Tears welled up in James' eyes. He had spent years feeling invisible, like the world had moved on without him. And now, in the middle of the street, with cameras recording and strangers watching, someone was giving him a second chance. James reached out, his fingers hesitantly wrapping around the keys. The metal felt cold in his hand, but for the first time in years, he felt something warm inside, hope. Then, just when it seemed like this was the moment everything would change, another voice interrupted. "Excuse me, sir." A woman stepped forward, her face pale, her hands shaking. She wasn't looking at Shaq. She was staring at James. "Is your name James Carter?" James' breath caught in his throat. His grip tightened around the keys as he slowly turned to face her. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "Why?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I've been looking for you for years." The air felt like it had been sucked out of the street. The crowd leaned in, waiting, holding their breath. Shaq glanced between them, realizing that this story wasn't over just yet. James felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. He stared at the woman, his heart pounding. His name hadn't meant anything to anyone in years, but now it was being spoken like it carried weight, like it mattered. His voice was shaky. Who are you?" The woman took a small, uncertain step forward. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I work with a shelter downtown. Your daughter has been looking for you." The words hit James like a wave. His knees felt weak, and he had to steady himself against the cart. "My daughter." He could barely get the words out. It had been years since he had last seen her, since he had lost everything. He had convinced himself that she had moved on, forgotten about him. But now she was looking for him. Shaq placed a reassuring hand on James' shoulder, grounding him in the moment. "You hear that, man," he said gently. "It ain't too late." Tears slipped down James' face. He clutched the keys in one hand, his other gripping the cart that had been his whole world for so long. But now, for the first time, he had something else. Hope, a future, a chance to rebuild. Sarah pulled out a small piece of paper and handed it to him. She left her number. "If you're ready, she wants to see you." James stared at the paper, then at Shaq, who gave him a nod of encouragement. With a deep breath, James wiped his tears and held the paper close. "I think I'm ready," he whispered. The crowd, once just onlookers, had become witnesses to something real, something powerful. And as Shaq gave James one last pat on the back, he knew this wasn't just a moment. This was a new beginning.